So let's talk about how we build these attribute queries with SQL. Not necessarily just within ArcPro, but how do we build them? So first you have to understand that SQL queries do have a particular syntax. There are rules particular to adhere to when you construct them within ArcPy. So you're going to notice here a little bit of a difference in how the query is laid out when it comes to doing this in ArcPy versus what we just saw there in ArcPro. But let's go through the rules that we have. First is that your field name must be surrounded by quotes, and that right there is the thing that's different than when you query these out in ArcPro. In fact, I'm going to go back here and I want to show you that. Notice how in the Select by Attributes window here, your field name is not surrounded in quotes in the SQL query within ArcPro. All right, so that's just a difference that you want to be aware of. So if you're going into ArcPro and structuring your SQL query, copying and pasting it and bringing it out into ArcPy, just be aware that the structure of the query is not going to be exactly the same in ArcPy as it was in the ArcPro tools. All right, so field names need to be surrounded by quotes. If the field is a text or a string field, like our park name was when we had the Alamo in the screenshot before, the string that's within that, so Alamo, must also be within quotes. Our SQL queries can actually use wildcards, and these are places where you can put in a placeholder where anything could be in a part of the attribute query, and we'll play with those and you'll get to see what that means. You can also query for null and empty records, and we're going to talk about what the difference is between null and empty shapefile and geodatabase and how you do that. And finally, and or, those Boolean logic can be used to build complex SQL queries. So we're going to go through and we're going to learn about each of these as we walk through. So the first one here, that field names must be surrounded by quotes. So here are some of our field names in our little snippet of data here. And you can see that if you were to start a query that's going to look at any of these fields, be it park ID, park name, park type, it doesn't matter if the field is a numeric or a text type, all of the field names have to be surrounded by quotes. Then, if you have a text field, all of the text within that field that you're going to query for must also be within quotes because it's a text string. So if we wanted to query for the park that has a name of Mabel Davis, we would query this out as park name with double quotes around it is equal to Mabel Davis. Same with park type is equal to district. Notice here on the left and the right hand side of the equal sign. On the left hand side we've used double quotes, and on the right hand side we've used single quotes. This is simply a professional best practice convention of using double quotes for the field names and single quotes for the text string within those fields. You're going to learn a little bit later here how we're going to manage for quotation marks when it comes to scripting out a full where clause for use in ArcPy, but just notice that you could flip these. The single quotes could be around the field names, the double quotes could be around what's inside the field, or both of them could be double quotes, both of them could be single quotes. But just understand that most times when you see this written out from other people, you're going to see the convention of double quotes for the field name and single quotes for the text string. All right, so I mentioned wildcards. So wildcards in SQL use like instead of equals, because when we're searching for things that are wildcards, we're saying we want something that we don't know the exact spelling or the exact characters that's going to be within this field. So we can't use the equal because there's nothing that's going to be equivalent of something we don't know. So we have this wonderful query term called like. Like is paired with, more often than not, the percent sign and sometimes the underscore to represent where we want the wildcard to be placed. So let's talk a little bit more about this thing, why like? Well, like is the operator that we're going to use to query out things that we don't exactly know all of the spelling. You might not know the spelling, or you might want to just grab a bunch of records that you know have a common word in them or a common set of characters, and you could put the percent sign then on either side maybe and query for something that just had a set of characters within the middle of the field. So we don't use equals because there's nothing equal to that with the percent sign. In fact, if you were to replace that with the equal sign, it would be looking for something with that exact string, MISS percent sign. When you swap out like, that is what cues it into the SQL query that you're looking for something that is going to be similar to what's in the text, and then where it sees that percent sign, it's going to go and replace and find anything that comes after MISS. So let's talk about the difference between the percent sign and the underscore. The percent sign is the one that's most often used. It can represent any number of characters. It can represent 1 or 100. So if we wanted to select out of a state's database every state that started with an O, we would say name is like with a capital O and percent. And any state in our data set that starts with a capital O would be selected out. If we want to just look for something that has a single character, so we know that we just want to replace one character as our wildcard, we can use the underscore. So if we wanted to select for all of our states who had a name that ended in HIO with only one character before that, we could structure it like that, leave off the O for Ohio, put in an underscore, and it would go through the table and find everything that had any character plus HIO, which we all know in the United States would only be Ohio. But if you only want to put a wildcard in for a single character, that single character can be anywhere in the text string. It can be in the middle, it can be at the beginning, or it can be at the end. The underscore is the one you want to use. So let's talk about now querying for null and empty records. Those are our records that have nothing in them for a particular field. So the thing here to remember is that file geodatabases and shapefiles store empty attribute data differently. File geodatabases store empty records as null, and shapefiles store empty records as an actual blank space. There's nothing in the field. And a side note here, if you are working with file geodatabase feature classes that have been created from shapefiles, so if they have been migrated or imported into your geodatabase, they still will store empty records as blank space. So only those file geodatabase feature classes that are created from scratch within the file geodatabase will you see the empty records stored as null. And you can easily see this. Just open up your data set quickly into ArcPro, open up the table, and you'll be able to see if an empty field has a null inside of it or just has blank space. So we're going to talk through how you would query for these nulls and empty records in the shapefile data model, in the geodatabase feature class that used to be a shapefile, and also within a geodatabase feature class. But this slide's a little busy, so we're going to pare this down and just work with them one by one. Here's our shapefile. So we have a shapefile that's Oxford Township center lines here. We can see a snippet of our field and of our table, and we can see that the top record there with the FID of 0 has empty information in the name field. Well, let's say we wanted to query in this data set for all of our records that were empty for name. Well, we can see here that in ArcPro, the field is just simply empty. And if we open up the Select by Attributes tool, in order to select out for an empty record, if you were to use the SQL query in ArcPro, you would see that in order to select for a blank record in a shapefile, the way ArcPro structures that SQL query for you is the field name is equal to, and then a set of quotation marks with a space in between. Empty records are selected using empty space. So in ArcPy, you would translate that over. Remember, in ArcPy, we have to have quotes around our field name. So quotes around name is equal to open single quote space, close single quote. And that query right there will select out all of your empty or blank records within a shapefile. Next, let's look at our geodatabase feature class that once was a shapefile in a previous life. If you open up that particular data set in ArcPro, you're going to see that their records that have nothing in them are still empty. All right, so there's nothing sitting there. And you would use the exact same query for this geodatabase field. The name with quotations on either side is equal to open single quote space, closed single quote. And remember, that's all driven by how this information is stored in the table. And you can always open up the table in ArcPro and check that out. So let's look how an actual geodatabase feature class, a data set built within the geodatabase, how it looks. You're going to open up those records and you're going to see that anything that is blank actually has a physical thing called null inside of it. So that's the equivalent to blank. There's nothing in it, but the geodatabase model, that object-based data model, stores it as a physical thing, as a null. And if we were to open up the Select by Attributes tool in ArcPro and query for that within the desktop environment, we would strip out a query that is the field name using is and then null. That's how you would query out those null records. It's not an equals because null isn't a string or a number that it can find. It is its own thing. So you would have the field name is null. Now notice how you do that in ArcGIS, right? We take the field name, for us here it's called area. We put area in double quotation marks. Notice you have to type that out in the same uppercase, lowercase that it looks like in the table, because you're putting double quotes around it. It becomes a string. The field name called area is null, and is null is in all capital letters. So all three of these methods are going to select out blank or empty records, but how you do that query is completely dependent upon the data type that you have. And for a geodatabase feature class, it's completely dependent upon the original database home of that feature class, whether it was once a shapefile or it was created within a geodatabase. All right, we also can query with our Boolean logic with and or. So these are wonderful. Just remember, you have to be careful which one you choose. Often if you choose the wrong one, you'll notice very quickly when you're selected set that you either have way more records than you wanted, or you end up selecting out nothing. And you realize, oh, instead of and, I wanted or instead of or, I wanted and. But here are some examples of using an SQL query with that Boolean or and logic to select out records from a data set. So let's say we wanted to select for states that have names of Ohio and Indiana. Now, when we speak that in language, in English, we would want to say, I want to select out for all the states that have the name of Ohio and Indiana. Well, really, there's no state that has the name of Ohio and Indiana. So in true logic terms, we would be saying select for states that have a name of Ohio or Indiana. So when we script that out here with our SQL query, we would have our field name is equal to Ohio or field name is equal to Indiana. Remember, when you do these and or logics, you have to repeat the field name. So field name is equal to one option or field name is equal to another option. You can also combine and or. You could select for all of the US cities that are named Columbus that are also within Ohio and Indiana. So if we want to select out for all the cities that are named Columbus from a US cities data set, we would say city name is equal to Columbus. And if we also want to select out all of those that might hold information about our state name, we would use and then that complex query there has parentheses around it because we're wanting to treat the name is equal to Ohio or name is equal to Indiana as its own thing. Think of that as almost as a mathematical operator. You want to do that logic query on its own and then pair it with and to Columbus so that you would get all cities that are named Columbus that also have either Ohio or Indiana as their state name. Finally, we can select for US cities that are named Columbus that exist in just Ohio. And there we would select out for the city name is equal to Columbus and the name is equal to Ohio. So there we're selecting from two different fields. We're wanting one record, one identifier from one field and another identifier from another field, and any records that have both of those fields, one equaling Columbus and one equaling Ohio, those are going to be the records that would be selected with that proper selection.